In fact, even at that time, it was a very clear thought that India will have to have a national response for vaccines. The reason was that the population was so big that even if you had access to vaccines from somewhere else, there was no guarantee that you would have access to vaccines for 135 crore people and two doses of that. There was a situation where a truck driver had driven from Pune to Belgaum. Overnight, he reached there at some 2 a.m., 3 a.m., some late night hours, which, by the way, this is person's day job, but simply because the people really believed in the vaccines. They really knew that this was the only way we will tide over the problem. Clearance in the customs. Things used to come from US in terms of the raw materials. In Mumbai airport, there was a separate terminal area only for clearance of these things. So they said whatever is required for COVID, we will just physically create an area. As soon as the aircraft lands with that material, you just take it straight away to that area, designated area, get cleared in a matter of hours, if not minutes.
Namaste and welcome to the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. We've often rued our lack of state capacity, but we've transformed on that front, especially over the last 3 years, in perhaps the most trying circumstances. And to that end, our COVID vaccination efforts have been a monumental achievement. On this podcast, we discuss a fantastic book that documents our vaccine journey, Braving a Viral Storm, India's COVID-19 vaccine story. Together with me, we have the authors Aashish Chandorkar and Suraj Sudhir. Aashish works as a counsellor at the Permanent Mission of India to the WTO in Geneva. He's a lateral entrant to the government, having spent more than a couple of decades in management consulting and financial services. He has been writing on public policy in domestic and international media for several years. Of course, he's a friend of the podcast. You've seen him on multiple episodes before. Welcome back, Aashish.
Hi, Carrie. Good to be back.
Suraj Sudhir works in the field of computer systems and machine learning in the SF Bay Area. He has maintained an avid interest in modern global and Indian economic history, with a particular focus on understanding the quantitative underpinnings of development. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he tracked and wrote extensively about the progress of the Indian vaccination effort. Welcome, Suraj.
Thank you.
So thank you both for joining us. And I think, thank you for writing this book. As I was saying before we started recording, it's a mandatory read. It makes you feel really proud of being an Indian. And I'm looking forward to delve into various aspects of the book. So Aashish, perhaps we'll start with you. How did this book come about? What was the process like? And also, if you were to summarize the Indian COVID-19 vaccination effort in a few facts and figures for our audience, that would be a good context to begin with.
Right. So, see, the Indian vaccination effort, let me start in the reverse order, right? So, Indian vaccination effort actually completes 2 years of its journey on January 16th. In this 2-year window, we have administered more than 220 crore doses domestically. We have also exported almost 29 crore doses of vaccines. This is the figure as of early January. Things change a little bit, but that's the rough number. In this, we've had intellectual property developed for a range of vaccines. For example, the Covaxin, there's a nasal vaccine from Bharat Biotech, there's a DNA vaccine which Zydus Cadila made, there's a mRNA based vaccine which Geneva was making in Pune, so that may not have been used, but the technology now is kind of understood in India. There was Corbevax, which we made based on the inputs from the Baylor College of Medicine in Texas. This was made by firms in Hyderabad, biological E mainly. We had Sputnik made in India by a couple of firms. And of course, we had the Covishield, which was under license from AstraZeneca. So I don't think any other country has that range of vaccines. In fact, at some point, even Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine was supposed to be made in India for exports under some international cooperation. So I don't think any other country has that range of vaccines which were, research produced, marketed, exported, and of course, domestically administered at the scale that we did. So it's by all accounts, it's a phenomenal achievement, fairly unique in its scope and fairly unique in its successful kind of endpoint. Of course, it's not ended yet, and we don't know how long the pandemic will continue, but reasonably, it's holding ground reasonably well so far. India has not seen a large third wave after the devastating second wave. So we have really managed, after the vaccination picked up, things have really been kind of all right in India. So that's also a testimony to the success of the effort purely from an outcome standpoint. On the book itself, Carrie, so two things. Firstly, Suraj has been writing several threads on Twitter for the last 3 years on COVID. He has also collected a lot of data and information. I was also writing about this. Even on Bharat Vata, we did a couple of episodes on various aspects of COVID, like lockdowns and medical capacity and stuff like that. So we have had a few discussions. I've also been involved in some of those discussions. So since both of us were doing this, we had decided long time back that we will get together and make this book come true. So in that sense, it was like a natural outcome of what we were following, researching, talking about through the COVID period. Also, very importantly, I mean, if you see the results and if you see how the process has gone about, I think it's a great moment of pride for how the country has delivered. Where like it's a raucous democracy. We had opposition, we had people supporting something, yet everything, all forces came together, right? The central government, state governments, the scientific institutions, the scientists themselves, the biologists, virologists, and of course the general public, which also participated with great zeal and enthusiasm in the drive. So in that sense, it makes a story which is a great triumph of India's ingenuity and India's ability to get things done at a very, very big scale, which a lot of other countries cannot really claim to do. So I think those were the kind of reasons why we thought we will bring it up now. And since it's like 2 years coming up of the anniversary, this we thought was a good time to release the book to the public.
Yeah, and in such trying circumstances as well, right? I mean, the last 3 years have been a blur, but it's important to remind ourselves that there was just so much ambiguity and 67 lakh deaths worldwide and counting at this point of time. Right, and so which is why I think it's really important to record that contemporary history so that it's not forgotten, right? And we take lessons from Suraj. Again, fantastic effort with the book. What were some of the challenges and constraints in vaccine development in general?
Sitting here quite far away from India at the present, this is a very good question with a lot of potentially deep thoughts about the topic. One of the things is that we've often struggled not just with implementing something at the scale, but also being able to quantify what is good and bad performance when it comes to performing a national immunization effort or vaccination effort. For example, if you ask Indians to come up with one phrase that defines vaccination, they would mention pulse polio. That's something everybody's heard of. We've all been vaccinated, we've seen the drives, we are proud of it. And in many ways, it is a very high profile thing. But really, if you look at it, India was the fourth from last country to eradicate polio. Every other country, rich, poor, successful, war torn, they all got done a lot before us. But how did that happen? Why did we only get done in 2011 when Somalia succeeded in 10 years before us? And I'm not disparaging them. It gives you a sense of every other country had all gotten done by then. So we sometimes tend to focus upon small victories while not considering that we have historically been unable to come together and bring together our resources and capabilities to tackle a problem at the scale before. And now we have something where we were compelled in the full harsh glare of public eye to do something as well or better than the rest of the world with nowhere to hide it all. And we had to learn from everything we did wrong in the past and try to do everything correctly in a far more compressed time frame in the course of a year, as Ashish mentioned just now. So there were so many challenges. To give you one example, we tried different vaccines. He mentioned 4 or 5 of them. In the past, we have done so, and we have found that we went ahead and applied them, and they were not suitable to Indian conditions because they became less efficacious in the hot weather. That was the case with smallpox. So we ended up doing large vaccination drives with ineffective vaccines, which worsened the pandemic at the time of that particular illness. So there were all these factors to keep in mind. There were an incredible number of challenges ranging from what to do, how to go about doing so, how to scale things up, and all of them had to be done perfectly right this time around.
Right. And also the time constraints, right? I mean, vaccines typically take, I think, 5 to 10 years to develop. I think maybe the previous record was the mumps vaccine, which was developed in about 4 years. And it has so many of these clinical and regulatory challenges as well, not to forget the logistical aspects of it. Ashish, what was the day zero of the vaccine development response? The initial days, if you could just walk us through, the days and the weeks of the initial response.
In fact, the day zero came very early in the process. The day zero, which is where we have an official record of a meeting, was actually May 5th, 2020. Now, the pandemic hit India largely in March, although there was one case in January, but the spread really happened in March of 2020, right? So, while of course at that time the top of the mind issue was lockdowns, preventing the spread of the virus, slowing the spread of the virus because we were not prepared in terms of testing kits and PPE kits and masks, etc. But even at that time, India was thinking of vaccines. On May 5th, there was a meeting which Prime Minister Modi had chaired, and in that meeting, the vaccines options was discussed. In fact, even at that time, it was very clear thought that India will have to have a national response for vaccines. The reason was that the population was so big that even if you had access to vaccines from somewhere else, there was no guarantee that you would have access to vaccines for 135 crore people and two doses of that. Also, even if you had that access, what would be the price for that? Right. So these were questions pretty much articulated and well understood straight away, like in May 2020. And this was very important because, again, it was not so much that you were close to the idea of getting vaccines wherever they came from, but it was a recognition of the constraint and a unique challenge that we faced, that unlike other countries, India had to rely on its own ingenuity to some extent, because there was no guarantee that you will actually get that many vaccines. And since the nature of the virus was such that no one was safe until everyone was safe, you couldn't just say that, okay, I will only vaccinate X% of the population and then wait for the vaccines to arrive, the rest of the vaccines to arrive, right? So this national response concept was very well understood practically upfront. I mean, in the second month of the pandemic. Now, on 9th of May 2020, India announced the public-private partnership, where ICMR, announced a partnership with Bharat Biotech, which would then lead to the development of Covaxin. If you compare it with other countries, the Operation Warp Speed in US, the much touted program, was announced on 15th of May, 6 days after our announcement. UK started funding its manufacturers, including AstraZeneca. I mean, they announced their funding program a couple of days later, I think on 17th of May. And then the EU was already doing a lot of research on viruses, vaccines which will be needed to combat viruses. So this research has been going on for a long time in EU, for several years actually. But the adapting to that, to COVID, and essentially creating a funded program and a defined program happened in July of 2020. So in that sense, of the countries which actually made successful vaccines, we were the first to have a public-private partnership announced. Now, this is not well appreciated because, a lot of noise got created around Operation Warp Speed. But our response was as agile as it could have been. The only country which had a PPP before us was Australia, but their vaccine did not succeed. Like, their homegrown effort did not succeed. So they kind of did not pursue that further. So yeah, the early days, firstly, there are two important points: that the early days were very clear in their conception on what was needed. And the early days really came early in the life cycle of the pandemic. It was not an afterthought after several months or several, or after a year. We were very clear straight away that vaccines were the only solution, whatever solution, whether it's reducing the spread, or at that time it was not known what will vaccines do. But I think the idea was clear that whatever be the impact on the virus in terms of reducing its impact or slowing its spread, that would have to have a vaccine response.
I was just going to add a small bit of information. I do not have Ashish's command over the precise dates of the official responses, but I'd like to add that before those dates came about, there was officially visible information about how quickly India had postponed. And India is one of the first 4 or 5 countries to isolate the virus initially, from a traveler who came back from Wuhan, China in February 2020, and that's 2 months before the lockdown. And there's a paper that was published in March by the National Institute of Virology in Pune, notifying that they had succeeded in isolating that strain. And if you have received Covaxin, you have received the vaccine that was the result of that isolation of that strain way back in March 2020, February 2020. This was well before the lockdown, well before anything happened, essentially cutting edge with respect to anything anybody else was doing around the world in terms of speed of response. So it's that quickly. And if you look at the timelines with when Covaxin was developed, Covishield was developed, or any other one vaccine was developed, they're almost entirely contemporaneous. The rate at which they were able to go from one phase to the next and complete the process establishing the capability of the vaccine, what we were able to accomplish was essentially on par with what the Western world was doing with far greater financial resources on their hands.
Yeah. No, I mean, what I found interesting was you have this phrase called the entrepreneurial state in the book, right? You reference that. And, we can perhaps think about countries like Singapore, for example, right? At that scale, where we talk about the entrepreneurial state. But here was India being an entrepreneurial state at our scale and our complexity, right? Which was truly astounding. Suraj, just a follow up on my previous question to you regarding vaccine challenges, right? We've been doing vaccines for a while, right? I mean, we have inoculation drives for polio, TB, and so on and so forth pretty routinely. What had we learned from these, previous vaccination efforts that became useful for us in this drive for COVID-19?
There's both a qualitative and quantitative thing, meaning that the vaccines have to be good and they have to be produced in number. Now, TB, polio, smallpox are all quite unique stories in themselves. TB is a case where, from at the time of our independence, we had the ability to produce the tuberculosis vaccine, but until the present day, we have never been able to nationally come together and have a program at scale until very recently, where there has been an effort to try to eradicate TB by 2025, which hopefully will succeed finally. Smallpox, on the other hand, suffered from us not having any access to vaccine production at home at all or the capability. And not very well known fact is that almost all of the vaccines consumed by India during the early years of smallpox eradication came from the predecessor of Russia, USSR. They were one of the largest contributors of smallpox vaccines to the world in the 1950s and 1960s. But there's this thing called, there were two different kinds of vaccine at the time. You see, there was something that was more easily usable in more colder climates, like in Russia, but didn't work effectively in India. So we ran multiple drives, but with poor efficiency vaccines, which resulted in more widespread outbreaks of strains that were essentially impervious to the vaccine that had been in use. So that's a problem. The quality, even if we had access to vaccines in the past imported from abroad, it wasn't essentially suitable to Indian conditions. There were some seminal studies at the time, for example, from CMC Valor, establishing that certain vaccines are capable in India and certain ones are not. But all of this information, the research, and the need to connect together these studies together to the official response were not well aligned at the time. So it's necessary to very quickly find out, can we use this vaccine? Is it going to be good enough? Develop them, study whether it's capable, then quickly turn around and produce them at scale. Because anytime India needs anything for its non pediatric population, it has an order size of 1 followed by 9 zeros. That's a very large order size. Nobody normally has any kind of capability to produce that many of literally anything. So that's the kind of challenge we have in mind.
Right. Ashish, in the initial days, these mRNA vaccines were positioned as a sort of a premium vaccine, right? I mean, the latest technology and so on. But we chose to go the traditional route. What was the strategic reasons behind that?
So, of course, mRNA vaccine is a technology which is very specific, and in the West, for example, some companies had a head start there in terms of the research which they were doing. Like BioNTech, for example, had a fairly advanced platform which they knew about what how this research would lead to a vaccine. Moderna, which is a company in that space, also had been working on the same ideas. So, we had a very interesting conversation, Carrie, with Dr. Peter Hotez of the Baylor College of Medicine. He invented or created one of the vaccines, which was Corbevax. So he had explained this, that perhaps the world did not think, by world, I mean, he meant the Western world did not think that COVID would be this bigger, devastating virus. There was a recognition that COVID will be a problem, but perhaps no one thought it would be this big a problem. And hence, they thought that this was the quote unquote optimal type of a virus in which mRNA technology can be tested. And perhaps that was the reason why a lot of initial funding went to mRNA. Around the world, if you see, I mean, organizations which were trying to fund vaccines against the virus, they chose to start with mRNA because they thought that this would be the kind of a right-sized situation where there'll be enough number of cases in the world to assess the efficacy, but not enough. Not that the vaccine will be needed immediately. So they can take some time to make the vaccine, and the virus will not be that deadly. But of course, I mean, that calculation was proved wrong. And again, this is like this was his personal opinion, which he gave us. So, but there was clearly a very specific focus on mRNA for whatever reason. None of the other vaccines in other parts of the world got funded. That's a fact. Funded to the extent that the mRNA vaccines were funded. So there was clearly an attempt to understand, if this was the way why how mRNA technology could be advanced, or how it could be made ready for other usage, which, as we know, I mean, cancer vaccines is where the main kind of focus lies, that eventually, we would want to create vaccines against some types of cancers. So in India, again, we had the experience with the traditional technologies and the traditional platforms, which is what Covaxin, for example, I mean, Bharat Biotech started off with that proposition that they will do what is known, and they were quite confident that the same technology should work in this case as well. So I think it was the choice was driven, of course, by what was already available knowledge base wise in different countries, how far their companies were on different platforms, and the confidence of getting something done. Because again, while there was no playbook for COVID in general, it was clear by April, late April, early May, that you would need a quick vaccine quickly. I think that part was very well recognized, right? So in that sense, my idea in India, of course, was to start with what could be done, and that's how Bharat Biotech chose a very conventional type of a way to go.
Right. Suraj, you guys talk about the importance of having an indigenous vaccine in the book, right? Could you elaborate a little more on that, and also how we sort of accelerated some of these clinical trials and
Yes, of
expedited the
course.
whole process as such?
So there's a very good case of contrast between the Western response and the Indian one. And you might recall reading the news stories about the West committing billions of dollars into the vaccine protection and development effort early in the middle of 2020. We were talking about $10 billion or $15 billion. In fact, these are all numbers larger than the total amount of money that India has spent altogether on everything to do with COVID-19 so far in the last 2 years. So how do they spend so much and not really potentially get as much out of bang for the buck, so to speak, out of their efforts? There's something Ashish mentioned just now. A vaccine, in India's case, must be cheap, it must be capable, and it must be producible at scale very, very quickly. Those are immediate things. The government has to be able to afford them. If it's great and if it can be produced but it can't be afforded, it doesn't work. We don't have the money. For example, right now, the per dose price of the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine is over $100. Multiply that by 1 billion people, and that's $100 billion. That is probably more than the national budget. So it had to be done in many different ways. And there's also some kind of incentive mismatch. If you give somebody a very large check, let's say for 25,000 crores, and tell them come back quickly with a vaccine, do you think it's going to work out extremely well? As compared to another side that says, look, I know you're a great vaccine producer, you are very well known, tell me whatever you need to develop a vaccine. If you need me to import something for you, some kind of a machine, some kind of a technology to help you develop any kind of chemical you need to do this, whatever it is, go straight to the PMO. You will get it done overnight. We have somebody working with you every single day. Just pick up the phone and call us. But just stay focused on this. If you need any money for anything at all, we'll write you a check for it. It doesn't have to be a large amount. We just need to make sure we unblock you every step of the way so we can focus on developing this. Which do you think is the better incentive structure? Giving somebody a big check and just letting them walk away and come back at some period of time, or something where you're completely hands-on, which is was effectively the Indian response. Ashish has documented the specific dates and the meetings. We have documented that in the book too. So this is how the Indian response was. This was very hands-on from the top down. Essentially, come and tell us if you need anything at all. There's never going to be a barrier. Just focus on getting this done. And that was something given to every single company, which is why today they all say that this could not have been done without the kind of complete freedom of access to develop and focus on just the challenge and solving the challenge that they were able to do. This was something I do not think I have seen elsewhere, where the companies were sort of a black box and they announced a successful vaccine, or that inexplicably a company with a long track record has failed to come up with a COVID vaccine, as in the case of, I believe, GSK. That's GlaxoSmithKline, who are a well-known pharma company. So there were cases like this. Whereas in Indian case, we had 4 or 5 different vaccine capabilities, including a DNA vaccine, the world's first ever, and that's pretty amazing. How did we do that? From relatively a small number of companies who aren't exactly worldwide known, but just popular and well known in India. That's because they were backed, I think, and they were encouraged and supported all along the way.
Yeah, one thing that is just amazing is throughout the book, you see the PMO's office, right? I mean, the office being directly involved in a lot of these things, very, very hands on, and not just the PMO, I mean, even the Prime Minister himself. Ashish, we also did a fantastic job in procuring these vaccine supplies, right? I mean, I think one thing that even the G7 countries realized is that you can't just throw money at the problem. And again, if you look at the math in terms of how much we procured and what we spent about 45,000 crores for about 240 crore doses, right, as of July. Yeah, could you talk to us about the strategy behind procuring these vaccines? I know you cover that in detail in the book, but just a snapshot for the listeners.
Sure. Maybe I can give you a qualitative perspective, Gary, and maybe Suraj can add some of the data and some of the other perspectives because he had done fairly extensive collection of that information. I see the main question here was, okay, who gets to buy the vaccines? Now, think of a situation where the demand is far outstripping the supply, right? The product is not ready anywhere in the world. No one really had the product, let's say, until late 2020, which is when the first approvals of vaccines started coming into play. Now, where do you buy the vaccines from? Like, just as like, can you allocate a sum of money and say, okay, I will allocate this money, but give me vaccines? That's not going to happen because the technology was evolving. There were other dependencies on clinical trials and regulatory approvals. Cross-border approvals in some cases were required. So our approach to procurement was that as the ramp up happens, government will keep allocating budget and keep getting a required number of doses, which would then can form the base to create the next batch of doses, right? There was like a batch by batch, phase by phase approach. And of course, the government started to procure itself, meaning the procurement was centrally controlled for the same reason that you don't want to confuse the small number of vaccine makers, that several entities approaching you, and you don't want to kind of burden them with any decision on who to give the vaccines to when the commodity is rare in itself. So it became, I mean, the idea was to keep the system fairly transparent. Now, if you remember, in April, on 18th of April, I think on 2021, the government did decentralize because there was so much pressure from the states and there was a lot of commentary that the central procurement was not working. You needed to have state procurements. So while that was not the right logic, it was not that procurement was not working. The fact was there were no vaccines. So it didn't matter who was putting an order. It would anyway have taken time. But nonetheless, since there was a lot of pressure from the states and this was the time of the second wave, the procurement was decentralized for about 7 weeks or so. I think the announcement was backtracked on 7th of June, 6th or 7th of June, and then I think 21st June, the old system came into place. So about 2 months, there was a system where anyone could procure. And by anyone, it means like a state government or a municipality or I think some identified organizations, identified types of entities could procure. So the tenders were floated, response was awaited, but actually like no vaccine maker responded to any tender. There were some responses received they were largely from traders who thought that they could buy in one country and then ship it to India in another country. But none of that succeeded, right? And I think eventually people saw through it that it wasn't that the central government was not trying to procure. It was that this is how it would work, that there is a very, very scarce commodity around the world. In some cases, vaccine doses were pre-booked by US and in case of EU. And when, of course, the demand far outstrips the supply, then there's a question of pricing as well as to what price which you will get the vaccines for. So procurement approach was driven by 2 or 3 considerations. There was fiscal prudence in terms of going stage by stage and procuring one block and the next block and the next block and so on. That allowed, of course, to see which vaccines to procure. Can there be better economies of scale at the margin and so on. There was also the understanding that just throwing at the money is not going to solve the procurement problem. Like you cannot just overnight increase the number of facilities or increase the number or increase the capacity or throughput of factories of manufacturing sites which were making the vaccines. So that was, I think, the qualitative part of it, and perhaps Suraj can throw more light on some of the numbers and some of his perspective as well on this.
Before I say that, I should also mention that I now recollect a question from Roshan that I forgot to answer clearly, and that's about how the government supported trials. I believe in the Indian case was rather different from how things normally happen, where a pharma company goes and recruits volunteers independently and performs the trial, whether the phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. But it was quite different in the case of how things were handled in India now. It's possible that the normal case in India too, but this time around, the government essentially took the responsibility and all of the bureaucratic trouble of recruiting people off the hands of the companies and readily established cohorts of people who could serve as the phase 1 or 2 or the 3 groups, and essentially spent the money on being able to get the people together and just told the companies, bring your vaccine and conduct the trials. Here, the group, we will take care of all the logistical details, which made things a lot easier because the companies could dedicate themselves to the actual technical development and finding out whether or not the vaccines are capable or not and working upon that. Now let's get down to the orders themselves. As Ashish mentions, the government made orders in batches. And this is where there was a lot of controversy back in April, May or so, where people were complaining that India should have gone back and placed an order, stood in the line very early, placed a very large order with name your favorite vaccine maker, but we never did that. But if you look at the data consistently starting from January down through the whole of 2021, there's a very consistent pattern that emerges that the government fundamentally places an order size commensurate with what can be delivered at a given amount of time. And that's approximately an order that is placed and gets delivered in between 6 and 8 weeks from the order date. So this is consistently true. They make an order for 100 million doses and it gets delivered within the next 8 weeks. And soon afterwards, they place another order that's slightly larger. And this tells us that the government and the companies had a very close communication where the companies were able to telegraph, we are able to scale up the production in the near future so you can make a larger order. And the larger order shows up and it gets delivered on time like clockwork. And this kept on going on and again and again. And what you see is a consistent pattern where the order sizes keep growing over time and they all appear batched with a sort of consistent period between them. If you look at the news articles, you'll see one in mid-April, and you'll see one at the end of May, and then you'll see one early in July. So that all the orders are being placed in a consistent manner and the order sizes are growing because the companies and the government are able to coordinate that this production is right, then you can place a higher order this time around. So there's a sort of just-in-time agile process of being able to make the orders in time rather than write a big check and say, quick, come back with us. But that leads to a sort of breakdown in expectations as to how and how quickly things need to be done. So this was a case of a very coordinated approach that was visible in the numbers, but not necessarily conveyed or articulated effectively at the time.
Right. I was looking at those purchase orders and I was trying to think through, what the logic would be, right? I mean, and how coordinated they had to be in terms of demand and supply. It's just, we talk about project management and IT and so on, but this is a whole other level of project management, right? Yeah.
May I add something more? That's what just the numbers talking. And during April and May, there were a lot of folks talking about how there was a vaccine shortage and there wasn't enough demand far outstripped supply. And these are a couple of personal anecdotes from far away. Sometime in the middle of April, and I have a good colleague, let's call him Jim. His wife was immunocompromised and could not take any vaccines. He has a family, and this is California, San Francisco, the richest state in the country, extreme. California had the GDP almost close to India's. At the time, vaccinations were only available to doctors and to the immunocompromised who needed them. But that didn't mean there was any access to the vaccines. Jim needed to get the vaccine because he and his family surround his wife who could not take the vaccine and she was ill. She's better now. So what did he do? On a Friday evening, he drove approximately 700 kilometers to a rural part of California where, through a community knowledge, it was known that they did not check eligibility requirements for vaccinations there. So he could not stay in a hotel. He could not stop anywhere. He packed sandwiches and water and he drove 700 kilometers in the night to a place where they did not check whether he's eligible for a vaccine, and then he drove back. And there were tons of people doing that, driving to sketchy rural places to get themselves vaccinated because they were not officially eligible, but they really needed to get vaccinated to take care of their loved ones. My wife, who's a doctor, was eligible early, but that didn't mean anything. She drove 150 kilometers each way to the nearest place where a vaccine was available after spending 2 weeks searching online. There's no such thing as coven here. So you call people, call all the shops and figure out, do you have any vaccine doses available? That's how it used to be at the time. And you drive up and come back. That's 250, 300 kilometers round trip for many people, minimum.
Crazy. Ashish, we've spoken about the development and the storage challenges, right? And Suraj alluded to that earlier. What were some of the challenges in the administering of the vaccines itself, right? You call out a few things in the book, like the scale and the acceptance and the time constraints and so on. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
I would say that there were, in fact, there's an article which we have written, hopefully it will come out soon, which was, there was a triple A response, right? And this is like the access, availability, and affordability. You had access, fine. You got vaccines, you made it available. But how do you make it available? Which was the second part. I mean, we spoke a bit about the affordability also, but how do you make the vaccines available? Because you got access to some vaccines. Now it has to reach the arms of the people, right? One, of course, was the scale, in which how do you prioritize the vaccine, right? So you've got different states, different union territories. How many vaccines do you send to each of them? How do you come up with that logic? So that was one question which to grapple with. Then how do you entice people to come and take the vaccines? What is the motivation there? Like, what would they refuse it? If they refuse it, what is the communication leverage you have to change their opinion? Who's influencing this process? So those were very real questions, and there was no guarantee that people would necessarily agree that they have to take a vaccine, right? And of course, there was this issue that it had to be all done in a very quick time frame, because the virus, the pandemic was still raging, and with the fear around the whole fear psychosis around how the second wave played out, the confidence building also needed a rapid response. I mean, it had probably had like 3-4 months to really demonstrate that vaccines can actually be distributed across the country. Now we have documented several episodes in the book, Carry, where there were situations like people, vaccinators, walking kilometers in snow and taking buses to remote parts of hills, and just for administering some vaccines, then walking back again the same route on hills and snow and getting back to their base stations. In states like Bihar, for example, there were motorcycle-based vaccinators, because they had to take the motorcycle and keep traveling to remote areas. In some cases, they use boats to go to remote villages. There were situations where we had used drones to deliver vaccines to remote parts of small hamlets in the middle of certain forest areas. Or I think there was a lake in Tripura where they had to send vaccines in that region because physical accessibility was more difficult than using drones. So this problem was, I mean, to even after you had the vaccines, the fact that it had to get to these all these kinds of diverse places around the country itself was a very humongous challenge and a humongous task. And of course, then came the question that you had to prepare the people. And I think what really mattered was that, if you remember, on March 1st of 2020, when the vaccination had just started, I mean, in January, but there was an algorithm, there was a wait, like when it was opened up for people about a certain age category, PM Modi actually went himself personally early morning to AIIMS and got a vaccine dose there. So I think that kind of started, or that triggered the process of people proudly advertising that they had taken a vaccine, right? And that became a great influencing mechanism, where it also became a great peer pressure, because of course, I mean, the politicians and the celebrities and politicians of all parties, I must say, this was a very kind of a unified effort for most part. Bollywood stars, cricket stars, other public celebrities, other sports stars, they were all kind of coming forward when their turn came eventually. I mean, I'm talking about like a few months of that messaging. That set a really good bar, or good kind of a practice. And I don't think any big celebrity really did a campaign against vaccines in India as it happened. I mean, of course, people may have taken, some for a time, they may have taken a different view, but there was no like concerted campaign by anyone influential in India to have banned vaccines or not use vaccines. So I think that played a great role. I think our influencer class behaved in a reasonably responsible way by themselves. And what also happened was that also triggered the chain of peer pressure, because people, it was not just the celebrities putting the pictures, but then people started tweeting their pictures or putting them on Facebook or sharing on WhatsApp. So that kind of, goaded others that, okay, fine, someone in my circle has taken a vaccine, maybe I should leave behind inertia and I should do the same. So I think those questions were, or those kind of actions were really important for this process to drive forward.
Yeah. So, Suraj, sitting in the United States, I mean, you would have had the vantage point of sort of comparing the attitudes to the vaccine itself, right? I mean, in the US versus India, in the US, there were multiple challenges to the vaccine, there's a lot of skepticism, protests, and so on and so forth. Why do you think there was such a contrast between these two countries?
Some of them are opinions, some of them are factual. To begin with, he spoke about all of these stories of celebrities demonstrating that they have been vaccinated, the inspiring pictures of people transporting the vaccines to remote areas. Those are all amazing, but they seem like they were a collection of inspired visuals. But I don't think it was the case, and there's something that is underappreciated, and that is a document that was published by the Indian Council of Medical Research and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare way back in November 2020. It's somewhat boring. It's almost 200 pages long. It talks about how to handle the entire process, including vaccine hesitancy, how to prioritize the vaccine delivery by age group. And if we fast forward 6 months and see how the age groups were defined, it's literally exactly as in the document, almost exactly. There were some tweaks in the age ranges, but a few other things. And it spoke about how to reach out to low level community leaders. And in India, we have a significant amount of trust with the local healthcare provider. People often know their local doctor extremely well and trust the person as a source of honesty and clear communication of exactly what are the risks and possibilities of getting some kind of medication or vaccine. And this trust, the social cohesion and contract in society exists in certain places in every country. There's some in India in familial units. In the health case, people being able to trust their local doctor, they whoever they reach out for their healthcare concerns, this exists and it can be utilized in this case. So there exists and several points of societal cohesion in India that can be utilized to convey information about how good or bad are these vaccines, how important is it for you to get vaccinated very quickly. Not just the celebrities themselves who are also spokespeople of this, but all of that was in the playbook. Talk to community leaders, talk to the low-level medical practitioners who often deal with their local community and are able to convey to the community that this is a really important thing for you to do and this is something you should do very soon. It's important for your health. There are certain side effects possible. This is what they are. Make an informed decision, but try to get yourself vaccinated soon. That message could be very effectively conveyed in a very broad distributed national scale in India very quickly. And that's something that was done. Whereas here, I think there was a sense that a lot of this came down to a very top down push. You should get yourself vaccinated if you know what's good for yourself. And if you don't, you're being completely crazy, unscientific. It was almost like being preached to and lectured from high up that sometimes can put people off and play upon existing political fissures. And some people just get completely intransigent. No, 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 I will never take the vaccine. And that totally shows up. There are several states in the United States that officially mandate that you cannot be checked whether you have been vaccinated. You do not have to show any proof of vaccination. Nobody is allowed to ask for proof of vaccination, which all sounds somewhat insane, but that's the reality. But that's never been the case in India because the messaging was far more hands-on, respectful, I think, towards the final consumer of the vaccines. And that's extremely important in this case because you must treat them with respect and recognize that they have concerns, but that doesn't mean that no, they just want to understand. So that kind of hands-on approach shows up all over the country. There are people who are necessarily all politically aligned, but we still have covered almost the whole country at this point of time, at least the adult population. And that counts for something. How have we been able to do so, despite the fact that people don't necessarily agree with each other? They have still proceeded to be vaccinated in a very short period of time. And there's never been any major thing that I will not get this vaccine because so and so person made it or anything like that.
Kenny, I'll add one point here, which is that while, I mean, of course, the messaging etc. was also quite clear. If you see the whole idea of vaccine passports, which came into play in several countries, see, our approach was quite balanced there, right? If you see it, we didn't say that. I mean, of course, there were rules and regulations that okay, you cannot access certain places without a vaccination, but we didn't push it too far. I mean, in some countries, it kind of got a little out of hand, I would say. Like either the rule enforcement became very very severe or very high handed in terms of denying people access to certain kind of public places. Either there was no naming or shaming, or there was a lot of naming and shaming. The balance was not really held tight in several other countries. I think we had a fairly good balance. We had some rules, but it wasn't that someone was chasing you for to deny you some benefits or deny you certain kinds of specific whatever your entitlements were based on your vaccination status. So I think it kind of maintained that thin line between being too invasive versus being too lax. So I think that part, I mean, it's more experiential. It's difficult to quantify that, but it's more anecdotal in nature if you see that relative to other countries.
No, that's a very subtle but very important point, right? Which is the fact that the vaccine communication in India was bereft of any condescension, right? I mean, you were not trying to bully people into taking this. And I think if you contrast that with the US, I certainly remember a bunch of Hollywood celebs making a video almost, mocking those who are not taking it, right? Being very smart aleck about it.
And I mean, there was another category which was mocking people for taking the vaccines, right? The very influential radio, TV hosts, or people who were very specifically into that. Yeah. So I mean, again, like not to kind of get into the names, etc. But that approach that contrast was quite visible between India and other countries.
Absolutely. So, Ashish, I think one of the lowest points, perhaps in the last 3 years, was this whole second wave, right? When the Delta variant really rocked the country, right? We went up to, I think, 4 lakh plus cases per day. And, when everything was at a standstill, right, the vaccine efforts continue to grow, right? And we continue to scale almost exponentially in the weeks and months, even during that time, right? And this is while dealing with a very federal structure, right? I mean, the states had their own mechanisms and so on, right? So, what do you think we did right during that time? I mean, if you can take us back to that time during the second wave, what were the additional pressures that the government faced and the various bodies faced, and how did they sort of mitigate all of those risks?
One additional pressure, which we have also mentioned in the book, is that there was a view that if the vaccination rates were higher, we would not have got the second wave. Now, that I think was a little oversimplified because, firstly, for a country of our size, theoretically, let's say we were not using Indian vaccines and we were trying to buy them elsewhere. And even if, let's say, we had prepaid for vaccines and we had some priority in the order, even then, was it possible to get 200 crore vaccines between January and April, or January and March rather, because the wave really started on 1st of April? Like, there was no way to say that in the 3 months that the vaccines had been available since January, could India have procured 200 crore vaccine any other way? Probably not, right? Even if you had prepaid for them or even if you had thrown money at it. So it was an oversimplified criticism that, okay, just because we were only using made in India vaccines or Indian vaccines, which is why we got the second wave, which I think was not probably the right criticism. And it was also the fact that the Delta variant hit us could have hit any other country. It just that the mutations happened in India. So that was one kind of let's say criticism which was happening around that time. Now, what was important was that even with all the devastation of the Delta wave, we still had to really keep our focus on the vaccines. The vaccine production had to keep running. So that was a time when the sort of facilitation happened by the government in terms of permissions needed to keep factories open, local support by local governments in terms of transportation and keeping, like, if in case there were lockdowns, where then how do you make them exempt for specific types of industries or specific types of factories? What protection is required in the facilities themselves to ensure that people are able to work? A lot of that required governance intervention at multiple levels, right, from municipal level to state level to central level, and again bipartisan effort on that count in several cities, because these were different states involving different types of political structures. So that was the focus, which also characterized the Indian intervention, which was a facilitation intervention, that we were trying to facilitate things rather than we trying to, let's say, trying to take a hands-off view of saying, okay, I will give you money, you do what you want. That was not really the way things worked for us. It was very very close involvement of government in solving in solving very nitty-gritty of the problems. In fact, this is not really vaccine related, but a great example is how one of the senior bureaucrats, Mr. Mahapatra, in the DPIIT, which is a Department for Promotion of Internal Industry and Trade, he was instrumental in tying up oxygen supply. Right, if you remember, we had a situation where the oxygen was being ferried from one state to, I mean, the oxygen producing states were different from oxygen consuming states, so they had to be carried from one state to another, and it was a very complex algorithm, right? It was like a amazing amount of operations research involved in terms of the loading effort, unloading effort, transportation. How much can a train carry? If the train was passing through a certain type of a terrain where, can you stack up things? What kind of design of the train carriage would be required? I mean, it was insane amount of logistics to be done in real time because the requirements were changing very very fast. Maybe in some city got hit badly, so there were literally like not even hours, but in some cases like in minutes or half an hour or an hour in which you had to react and plan for these things, right? Unfortunately, this officer passed away on the call of duty, and I mean, PM Modi actually paid him rich tributes for his contribution. But I mean, that was a level of engagement which was there from the governance side, that people had really taken it up to them to ensure that yes, there were deficiencies around, let's say, certain. I mean, not all parts of the countries were making oxygen, so how do you kind of how do you solve that? And once things did start getting stabilized, I think towards end of April, while the pandemic peaked, that wave peaked. So I think this whole idea of facilitation, intervention, solving bottlenecks, resolving little issues, right, small issues, I think that really was the highlight in which we kept those factories open. In fact, those months were quite critical because the real ramp up actually happened through those months. If you really see the production ramp up, it actually happened through April, May, June, July. So had we just closed down vaccine manufacturing for 2 months, saying that, okay, no, we have a Delta wave going on, we would have actually pushed forward, pushed back rather our, the number of doses that we could administer through June, July, August, and sorry, through July, August, and then ramping up from there. So those 2 months, actually, we continued to work while the pandemic was still raging very, very badly across the country.
I think another enabling aspect was the public digital infrastructure. And here again, using COVID to sort of track infections and vaccinations, integrating this with the Aadhaar database and so on, right? I mean, this was again an amazing initiative, right? Again, Suraj, being in the US, you get a chance to sort of contrast this with what's happening there. How important do you think this was?
This is an American vaccine card. It has as many safety features as a postcard. It's written by hand. You can probably easily duplicate it using a piece of cardboard and a printer. And there's actually a cottage industry of people selling these things. It's of course punishable by law, but I have no idea how you tell a really well done fake from the real thing. So, so that's as much as I have. And certain states do not even have this. And so they do not permit or allow official records. I have no idea what I would do if I got a vaccine dose in a state where those kinds of rules exist. So that's the kind of headaches. There's no such thing as the federal system. Certain states have them. California does. New York does. Other states don't. There's no such record. You cannot officially prove it. And I'm not quite sure how people do that even. The kind of thing like Coven nationwide, being able to get yourself vaccinated, find out where to get vaccinated, get your certificate, that just does not exist. And that's kind of sort of thing when we think about the best capabilities of the world, the best responses of the world across the developing world, that India probably sits at or near the top. We have the capability to produce everything we need at home, and the kind of technological infrastructure to track, administer, and certify the vaccination. That kind of thing is probably only a handful of countries in the world, including India. Yeah. Places like Japan don't have it. I know that firsthand, having been there recently. The United States doesn't. Some other countries do. But India, to manage that, I mean, we are not exactly a very wealthy country, but still managing to accomplish all these on essentially the cutting edge. There's a kind of barometer we need to set. We need to understand how good are we to the world standard. And in this case, we are nearly at or near the top. That needs to be appreciated.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think just speaking of the digital realm, I think we're much more advanced than anyone else in the world for sure, right? Ashish, while all of this was happening, things were manifoldly complicated by some of the commentary that we were hearing, right, by the naysayers. You had various things, like for example, people spoke about the rushed or supposed rushed approval of the COVID-19 vaccine without enough checks or balances, allegedly. Then the fact that should we be spending so much money, or are we spending enough money, right? I mean, both sides of it being argued. Then people, as you mentioned in the book as well, doing Excel extrapolations and saying that, hey, we'll probably take a decade to sort of vaccinate everyone at this rate, so on and so forth, right? I mean, what do you think the naysayers missed about the whole vaccine story? I mean, why do you think the commentary was so detached from reality?
We have mentioned some of these things in the book. Again, we have not tried to make the book, I mean, this is a positive story, right? So we've not tried to really look at each and every criticism or each and every statement made. uh, some could have been lack of understanding, some could have been, let's say, a lack of trust in the institutions, some could have just been just believing that India will not be able to do something, or rather just distrust that India can actually get something done. So there could have been different reasons. We don't know like who spoke from which perch. But I mean, that's not really the intent carry in the book. The book really talks more about. We have mentioned that this was talked about, but that we really haven't really gone into deep of why and who and what. The basic thing here is that in general, I would say that Indians, the society as a whole, demonstrated much greater faith and trust in the institutional arrangements than the commentators did. This is, of course, not atypical because it happens in other domains also. But in this domain, it was more significant because human life was involved, right? So the regulators who were really involved in the process, the scientists who were involved, in some, since we did speak to a lot of people, and again, this is not to quote anyone by name, but since we really spoke to a whole bunch of people involved in the decision making, there was this regret that people who have really given their heart and soul to the effort, their intention was questioned, that they were taking a decision because of whatever pressure, alleged pressure, or from different quarters. So that, I think, was what I mean, from the speaking from the point of view of who were people who were involved. I think that was their biggest regret, that a lot of the criticism was just misdirected in terms of intent. Ultimately, even had to take a call based on the available data. uh, I mean, data couldn't really have, data was what it was. The quality continued to evolve gradually. There was not necessarily one shot information always available, but regulators had to still take a call, because they still had to go ahead and look at a safe option of, I mean, looking at an option of making the country safe. In fact, in a way, the book kind of shows that despite criticism, and sometimes it's easy to get carried away with the criticism of the day, especially in our kind of discourse where there's a lot of media and social media. The volume of that is very heavy, and the raucousness is also very high. So it's sometimes easy to kind of get drifted into that kind of a direction. But when you look at things with the benefit of the hindsight, they could be significantly different, or they may paint a very different picture. So I think that is what the story which emerges here is, that again, maybe the medical science professionals should write more about this. Maybe they can do more digging about, we have written from the point of view of governance, right? That the process was followed. But I mean, if the medical science professionals believe that something was not done in a scientific way, maybe they should write more about it in more details, and this debate can carry on. But anecdotally speaking, obviously things look quite all right, in the country, both in terms of the safety of vaccines and the effectiveness of vaccines.
Right. And at a time when richer countries were kind of stockpiling vaccines and resources, we are actually leveraging these vaccines for diplomacy and so on, right? I mean, here of course I'm referencing the vaccine Maitri initiative. Suraj, what do you make of that? I mean, it seems to have emerged as an amazing geopolitical move from India's perspective, right? I mean, we've distributed tens of crores of these vaccines to so many parts of the globe.
That's a very good question, Roshan. And I think vaccine Maitri was, that is my opinion personally only. I think it responds to what was seen as a somewhat cynical process of procurement and distribution of vaccines worldwide, where there was the deliberate intent to ensure that the intellectual property behind the vaccines were safeguarded within Western hands and potentially with some convenient mass production capabilities outsourced to places like India, which were then used to procure these vaccines and distribute them to show up as a sort of charity. For example, if you look at the vaccine Maitri data, you see approximately 130 million doses of Covax being exported to the Netherlands. And the Netherlands doesn't have a population anywhere near 160 million people, probably about 6 million people. So what's happening there? It's really a process of routing the production through and using COVAX to demonstrate that the EU is being a benefactor to the world, but really the producer is India in this case. So vaccine mastery is a way to assert that we have had a significant role to play, even though the messaging tends to suggest that really who's doing so is somebody else. But there needs to be kind of an acknowledgement that we are also contributing significantly. Ashish mentioned this before, and this official data on the vaccine Maitri site. We have so far exported close to 300 billion doses of vaccines, Covishield, Covaxin, and Covovax primarily across the world, as direct transfers are the deliveries to COVAX. So these are the things where we want to assert ourselves publicly and not just seem passive. And it's important to state that not only do we start with charity at home, but we are also helping the rest of the world. And that shows up in the form of official acknowledgement by leaders from the Caribbean, from elsewhere in the world, who have received direct shipments as a matter of priority. So that's how it has been a beneficial thing.
Yeah. No, it I think truly epitomizes the ethos of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, right? For sure. Ashish, I'm going to get you to wear your consultant hat for a bit, right? I know you in a previous life you were a consultant and for 20 plus years. So, what are some of the leadership lessons that we can take away from COVID, this whole COVID vaccine drive and so on, right? So, if I were to make a LinkedIn post, tomorrow and put 3 points across, what were some of those lessons?
I will strongly discourage people from making LinkedIn posts with you know with numbered lists. I think that era of social media is hopefully gone, but maybe LinkedIn will catch up. LinkedIn has been a laggard in
Content over
terms of the
speech.
content strategies. So hopefully people will realize that it's not a good idea to draw 10 lessons from everything around you. But having said that, I would say I still mention a few points which were really critical for the vaccination program. The first and the foremost was the leadership which we had in terms of the political leadership from Prime Minister Modi. It was very critical to have someone who could take decisions and who could essentially go forward and make sure that what was really required for the gravity of the situation was what was being done. And that is in our system, which is a very complex system, very complex federal system, different bureaucracies, different levels, different maturity of states in their own governance process. I mean, it's still an evolving area for us, for India as a whole. So in that sense, this was a very critical factor, how we handled the whole pandemic, not just for vaccines, but for pandemic at large. Because and like again, a different non-vaccine example would be like the whole fiscal response, right? Like there was so much pressure around saying why is not that there's a demand side stimulus, but we kept saying that it is not a demand side problem. If the economy is going to be closed, you cannot give a demand side stimulus. It will essentially have no impact on the economy. And with the benefit of the hindsight, we were proven right. I mean, look at the inflation. In fact, the inflation data of this month has just come in. I mean, last of December, and India is already under 6% comfortably this month in December. I think the lowest inflation rating of the all of the last year. So while in the West, inflation is raging very, very strongly for several months. So some of these decisions can only be weighed in terms of their quality with a lag of time, right? How they play out, especially when a relative picture is available. So that kind of a leadership was important because when the pressure comes, you have to soak the pressure, you have to absorb the pressure. And even if sometimes it kind of discourages people in real time saying why is this not being done, there is always a reason why something was not being done, and you may not be able to talk about it in great detail, but that pressure was being absorbed. The second part was that really our science efforts were really they really came together, right? Both in terms of the public-private partnership, each party doing what was required, like the bureaucracies helping the process forward, the scientists working in a very focused and a very calibrated way towards an end result, and there were risk takers in the private sector who put their money in, right, in terms of what in terms of the vaccine development process, also scaling it up. So this combination worked very well, where each party did its role. Like if you see in the West, the government became a vaccine trader or a vaccine manufacturer. The private parties essentially became, vaccine. It just became a sales effort more than R&D. At some point, it became a sales effort, right? So in some cases, the governments became vaccine negotiators because they were not getting vaccines. So they had to, even the heads of state started negotiating for vaccines. In fact, we have described that process in the book. So this optimal combination of who does what and who does it best worked quite well in India. Government focused on governance, on the process facilitation. Private sector focused on risk taking, and the scientists really delivered on the content. Finally, the society really had got its act together in terms of vaccine acceptance, and as we discussed earlier, the maintaining the right balance of goading versus letting people be, right? And as Suraj pointed out, practically everyone has got vaccinated. I mean, maybe there are some people who have not, but practically everyone has got a vaccine. So it did not come through any great national debate. I mean, it was a very positive type of a movement where all influencers came together to paint the right picture. No one was trying to tout saying that vaccines are there were limitations of vaccines which were well understood, but it was communicated that way, that vaccines are not the be all end all of the problem. It will essentially reduce the severity of the disease and perhaps the spread of the virus. But that messaging was quite clear, which was also important in our view, because in some countries it was almost painted like vaccines will just solve everything. You take a vaccine, the virus will go away, which was not how it was kind of painted in India. So that communication strategy, the balance of that, who was leading the communication, as Suraj pointed out, a very comprehensive communication tailored in different languages for different types of social segments, differently done in villages versus differently done in cities. I think that package was really, really, and again, it was not a coincidence because this was a written document. I mean, this was released before the vaccination started. So that was, I would say that social response was the third defining feature of the program.
Suraj, in your opinion, who are some of the key personalities that we should be really thankful for? Of course, I mean, many thousands of people work together in this, gigantic effort, right, to keep us all safe. But if you were to call out maybe 3-4 personalities, boy, I'm really wearing my LinkedIn social media influencer hat for this podcast. But, if you were to call out a few people.
Well, there's a temptation to name well-known people, but really, I would have to decline that request and not mention certain key people. It's really the first responders, the medical professionals at large, who have had to work essentially tirelessly for more than 2.5 years, who I think are the first people you'd want to congratulate, because they're the folks who have had to spend weekdays, weekends. When you think about how many people, how much effort it takes to continuously vaccinate something like 10 or 15 million people a day for so long, that's a huge number. I mean, when it comes to people themselves, Ashish is probably the best person to ask. But if I want to thank somebody for this, that would be the people who were at the front line, accomplishing things, riding a bicycle, driving through the desolate areas to deliver things and essentially make sure the system works and gets executed. You can order anything from the top, but ultimately it has to be delivered end to end. And the people who got that done are the ones who deserve enormous credit for that.
I agree, Carrie. I think we shouldn't really characterize this as individual kind of content. There were several individuals. In fact, we have spoken to many of them, and they have been acknowledged in the book duly for their contributions. But really, it was a very unique national effort, right? It was a very a really sense of doing something together collectively and achieving something and getting over the pandemic. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. That it's not that it happens every day in the country. So the fact that we got it done had a lot of contribution. Actually, like, let me give you kind of a couple of anecdotes, right? Like which people don't know, and it's there in the book. So, for example, we were chatting with someone who was transporting the vaccines in Pune, a company called Coolx, which is a Pune-based company. They overnight, or not overnight, but let's say in a short period, they improvised their supply chains to handle vaccines. They used to handle other vaccines, but for COVID vaccines, they kind of improvised what had to be done. Now, what we heard was that there was a situation where a truck driver had driven from Pune to Belgaum overnight. He reached there at some 2 a.m., 3 a.m., some late night hours. There was actually a whole primary healthcare center waiting for this driver and the truck They garlanded him. They did a arti and the puja of the truck, and they actually fed him in the night. There was a full party, simply because the people really believed in the vaccines. They really knew that this was the only way we will tide over the problem, right? So people who contributed even for that small effort of driving the truck from Pune to Hyderabad, which by the way is this person's day job, but because he was driving a vaccine truck, he got a very special treatment that night in Belgaum. Similarly, situations were that in Chhattisgarh, there have been some cases where the local security was Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra border. The police was coordinating so well that they were handing off, each truck was getting an escort, for example, right? So they were, one government was essentially handing over to the other government, and cars used to wait. I mean, police jeeps used to wait at the border, so the truck doesn't stop even for a minute. Like the handover was so smooth because I mean, police obviously works by territory, right? So like in the states basically, but they would manage the border handoff so well that the truck did not stop even for a minute. It was like a smooth ride because those are remote parts, and the infrastructure is not always in some areas is not the best, but they still had to get the vaccines in time so that they don't get spoiled. So the contribution really goes in several different dimensions. What we really hear is the headline items or the leadership part of it, which was of course critical, but even at a low level, clearance in the customs, things used to come from US in terms of the raw materials. In Mumbai airport, there was a separate terminal area only for clearance of these things. So they said whatever is required for COVID, we will just physically create an area. As soon as the aircraft lands with that material, you just take it straight away to that area. No mixing and matching of things. No loading into one or two boxes and then figuring out what is COVID related. It was pre-marked. It was pre-defined what was COVID related material. They would straight go to a designated area, get cleared in a matter of hours, if not minutes. So I think that level of coordination is just unheard of in terms of other kind of situations which we see, and almost everyone understood that this had to be done because this was the only way country would then kind of come back to normal.
Yeah, I think
What this underlines is that this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, it was organized and accomplished on a national scale by millions of people doing all manner of little things coming together. It wasn't simply, oh, you got lucky. It was something like that. There was a method to everything.
that's actually the common underlying thread that I see in the book, right? I mean, how many different, very disparate things came together to make this happen? So, yeah, that was truly something to really, really commendable, I would say, right? Final question to both of you: what was your most memorable experience putting this book together, and what do you hope to achieve from this book?
So my most memorable, what I recall very well, is that we reached out to a number of people to talk about their contribution, their role, their experiences, and almost universally we got a very positive response. So even people who had complaints about things, even they spoke to us and recognized in the hindsight that yes, there were problems, but we kind of got over them, right? In fact, on the big book inauguration, for example, Mr. Mandaviyaji was saying this, that there was one question of vaccines, but then we never had any issue with, let's say, even with syringes, with needles, because all of it was kind of baked into the process, right? The vaccination did not stop because syringes were not available. I mean, you did not hear much of that kind of stuff. So each person had a contribution, and they basically delivered on that contribution, and we're happy to talk about it. So for my most memorable, best memories, that we had really, really deep, engaging conversations where people could talk their heart out and talk about what they did or what they couldn't accomplish. So yeah, I would leave it at that. Suraj?
On my part, probably the most effective, most impressive thing I have seen is this amount of cohesion on a national scale and working together towards this, whether you are part of solving the problem or simply one of those who are receiving the benefits of what people are working towards. And there are many different ways things have gone wrong, but it didn't. And when I started working on this personally, this was started as a personal interest thing. I wouldn't know what's going on here. How quickly could we solve the problem? Could we solve it at all? And as a development I drove, I was happy to see that this what seemingly boring detail had a lot of takers, people who are very keenly interested in tracking what's going on. They were patient, waiting for their turn. They understood how the process was trying to be accomplished. Early on, everybody could have just stampeded towards the corridor and demanded, I want to be the first, and been utterly selfish and had a free for all. There were traces of that, but by and large, the manner in which everything has been smoothly accomplished in a very diverse country, That was incredible. And it tells you that when you execute something efficiently, there exists a social contract between the system and the public that still exists and is very strong, and both sides can work together and get something done very well. And that was amazing to see happening in a very short time.
Yeah, fantastically summarized. Folks, this is a must read. Braving a Viral Storm. Get it on Amazon, Flipkart, a bookstore near you. One thing that I felt reading through the book was immense gratitude for all of the people who made this happen. And it really made me feel proud of being an Indian, really. And so, thank you so much for recording this piece of contemporary history. I mean, it's like I mentioned to Suraj, before we started recording, I hope 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, people will go back to the book and learn about these fantastic times, because I think 3 years have just been a blur, right? We tend to forget the odds that we were up against and what we've kind of gone through, right? So thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Suraj, for writing this book, and wish you all the best for everything you have coming up.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.